All right, I'm here with Joe Stanzione, former wrestler at Cornell University. He was my coach for most of my college career, and he also got his PhD in nutrition science. So, Joe, can you tell us a little bit about your background in the sport of wrestling and in nutrition?
Yeah, so a little bit of background. I grew up wrestling from young. About 5 years old, I started, which is kind of common, not as much anymore. But eventually, I went off to college. I wrestled at Cornell University, 133 pound, 141 weight class, um, and I got into nutrition through college wrestling. I was trying to make really in my junior year. I was still trying to make 133, and I was struggling a lot. I was making the weight off of sheer discipline, but not necessarily from a scientific standpoint. And then I had some interaction with people who knew a little bit about diet. Specifically, we had just gotten a sports dietitian, and he helped me a lot with essentially fueling my body and better approaches to weight loss. But really, it got to the point where the consensus was it's too much weight, and I moved up a weight class, and it was one of the best things I did. So I was like, oh, this nutrition stuff makes a little bit of sense. So
Yeah,
I relatively knew that that's what I wanted to do early, but when it really affected me as an athlete is when I kind of fell in love with it. So then I pursued it. I eventually went on to grad school. I got my master's in human nutrition. Then I went on to become a registered dietitian. And then after I was credentialed as a registered dietitian, I went back to grad school and got my PhD in nutrition science because I fell in love with kind of the research aspect as well. And that was really born out of the the gaps that exist in the literature. There's a lot in nutrition isn't a new science, but as it pertains to kind of sports performance and how it affects us, it's not in its infancy, but still in the early stages of us understanding it all. So I decided I wanted to research certain topics, and that was about around the time where I met you, Ebed, or a little earlier. And I was coaching wrestling while getting my PhD in nutrition sciences, but my research primarily focused on aerobic energy metabolism, which in layman's terms is essentially what you eat and how you produce energy in the long haul. So when you're looking to run a marathon or anything really above 10 minutes or longer exercise, how can you optimize what you eat and to affect that? But that's pretty much my background right now. As you mentioned, Ebed, I'm at the University of Memphis. I'm a postdoc. I work within athletics. I function relatively similar to a sports dietitian, but I also am tied to the university's research department where anything that we do with the athletes here, we measure it and to see how effective we are. And if not, we pivot our approach and see how we can make true changes as opposed to an athlete just telling us, oh, I feel kind of better. But we have the metrics to be like, well, we are influencing you in a positive way. So it's really bringing that science to the field.
that's awesome. So, looking back at your wrestling career, what do you feel like is some of the biggest mistakes you've made that maybe other people could learn from?
It's a really, really good question. From a dietary perspective, you're primarily asking.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, the weight loss kind of conundrum, if you will. I mean, to start, I think that weight cutting is totally a part of wrestling, and I think that some people struggle to understand that a bit. But there's definitely a limit to that. Where I fell short was the limit. I likely had a really low body fat percentage, although I never measured it in college. So I really had not much place to pull my weight from besides hydration and my lean mass, which would be my muscle mass. So I kind of got to a point where I was pulling from that and primarily hydration. But yeah, so if I had understood kind of what meaningful weight loss is as opposed to just acute changes, it might have helped me a bit.
And
Weight loss,
how much were you cutting when you were doing it too much?
I was trying to make 133 pounds. I was probably getting up towards 160 in my highest range. When season started to roll around, I could fight my weight down to the high 40s, high to low 40s, but then the rest of it was too tough. And that really was because, again, that misunderstanding. I didn't really understand how your body's weight fluctuates. And really, most wrestlers, unless they're educated, their weight loss is almost completely hydration. Um, and that's what I wasn't understanding. I was fluctuating my hydration more than I was changing my body composition. Right? Good weight loss we want to come from body fat, and the approaches that I wasn't taking were that mine were completely hydration changes. And that's also because I didn't understand that body fat loss has to happen slowly. You physiologically can't unpackage your body fat stores quick enough, that we think. We think that a lot of wrestlers think, well, I weigh 150 today, and on Friday I weigh 140. I lost 10 pounds. Well, probably 75% to 80% of that weight is water. Maybe some of it's body fat, but not, just because you lost the weight doesn't mean that it's the good weight. So understanding like how your body compartmentalizes things was where I kind of lacked for sure. And I think most do.
So what do you feel like is that weight that you're kind of just doing the water? Like what range would you need to be in? Like, is there a pound, like 10 pounds, 15 pounds, or is it if you're smaller, it's less weight than if you're, obviously if you're like 195, 10 pounds for a 195 pounder, it's a lot less than a 125 pounder. Did you find like a range that you feel like is healthy to do? Maybe just that ending water part where you've gotten your fat down enough and you're ready to just kind of get the last cut. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So not necessarily a range, but you're absolutely right. The bigger you are, the more rapid that weight can come off, just because you have more cellular mass than the smaller, 200-pound wrestler compared to like a 150-pound wrestler. They have more mass to take it from. But really, the appropriate way to approach it is, if you have a goal weight, that has to happen. Getting to that goal weight has to happen much earlier. And I'm talking off season. If wrestling season is starting in October, and you want to be at your goal weight, let's say that's 20 pounds away. You should be getting within a relatively close range of that 5, maybe 10 pounds for the bigger person by the time you're ready to get into season. And that's strictly from a physiological standpoint of being able to unpackage your fat. You have to do it over a longer period of time. You cannot do it in a short period of time.
Do you have like a time frame like that you've seen, like a pound of 2 weeks of fat? Like I don't know, is there something like that where people can be like, is it realistic for me to even hit this goal?
Yeah, I'd say about 1 to 2% of your body weight a week. So if I'm 150 pounds, that's probably a maximum amount of weight that I could lose within a week. That could be fat mass, and it's maximum. If you were really, really efficient, would be 3 pounds or so, depending.
Okay.
But again, that's if you're super, super efficient, and most of us aren't. I like to say anywhere from probably like 2 to 4. But anything more than that, so obviously we think about some of those changes that I'm talking about, like 10-pound cut in a week. If you're super, super efficient, only 2 of those pounds are going to be from your body fat mass. The rest of that's going to be your muscle mass and water, mainly water fluctuations.
Is it easier to lose muscle mass than fat? Like, do people tend to like lose a lot of muscle? Is that like a problem in wrestling where they're losing a lot of muscle mass because they're cutting the wrong way? Or is it more of the hydration that's more the issue and people are just dehydrated and that's.
I think about it 2 ways. From the body composition standpoint, there's this like vicious cycle in the wrestling weight cutting world. It's becoming dehydrated too early, and then your practices are subpar. Then your calorie burn is subpar, so you're burning less calories, which would be the true weight loss that you want. Burning calories is going to help facilitate that fat loss. But what a lot of wrestlers do is they'll cut that water early, then they'll slowly fight those last 3 to 5 pounds off, again depending on who you are, maybe it's more, and then your body essentially starving your body throughout the week, and then you have that huge hunger response. You weigh in, you overeat, you wrestle all day, you overeat, and then when you have that big bolus feeding of food in those 24-hour time span, maybe it's longer, you can put on body fat in that zone, because your body's protective, right? Your body's essentially in a starvation response, so it's going to try and hold on to what it can. It's been starving all week. And then you start your weight cut process again, and you starve yourself, and your body has to take it from somewhere. Maybe it's muscle, maybe it's body fat mass, but a lot of that's going to be muscle mass too. And essentially you create this vicious cycle of the binge eating at the end of the week, where you package and store body fat, and then the long-term weight cut of the week, where you're pulling from your muscle mass. So a lot of times you can see poor weight cutting, people will actually, their body fats will not change, their muscle mass will just drop because of that vicious cycle. And it's because you're starving yourself too early, you're dehydrating yourself too early.
So if you're, say I'm 10 pounds over, my weight class, and it's the start of the week on Monday, and I have a match on Saturday, can you walk me through what would be the best way to do that, and to not have to, and kind of flow into next week? Because you were making comments about after I weigh in on Saturday, if I eat Saturday, Sunday, and then a lot, then it would affect me negatively. So how would I go about from Monday to Saturday with my weight cut?
Sure. The biggest part of that is doing the work on the front end. Off season, getting your weight to a manageable place. So if 10 pounds is manageable, and I'd say 10 pounds is probably manageable for someone who can lose 3 to 5 pounds in a typical practice. It's probably a good gauge there. So if you're not that person, that might be a little too much at the start of the week, but probably manageable for someone your size, but maybe not so much for someone who would be my size. Okay. But doing the work on the front end, so getting your essentially your baseline weight at the start of every week being within a striking distance, which I'll say. So maybe let's use that 10-pound scenario. That's striking distance for you. And then being able to, so the first tier of it is maintaining your hydration up until that last minute. So drinking water consistently, never cutting out water until really the last scenario. It's going to do two things for you. One, it's going to hydrate you. It's going to prevent injury. It's going to allow you to get through practices and actually get benefit from learning techniques and the training scenario. But in addition, so then the weight loss has to come from somewhere, right? So the weight loss should come from small reductions in your eating throughout the week, but not extreme, right? This doesn't mean, this is not that starvation state, but being very strategic in what you eat, prioritizing the carbohydrate, which is your energy source. That's your grains, your breads, your pastas, your rice, and even your simple ones, your more sweet. So prioritizing those, because those are going to be energy for exercise. And so you're not only you're well hydrated, but you're fueling yourself. But the weight loss comes from the small reductions in the eating typically. And again, we're still talking about that striking distance. As long as we're in striking distance, we have the capacity to do that. Then let's say that gets you 3 to 5 pounds down. So you're 5 pounds down, you're about 24 hours out, then pulling from that hydration. So what you're doing is you're preserving that hydration to the last minute so you can feel good, you can ward off injury, but you can also have a quick acute loss. So that last 5 pounds, boom, we took it all from water. We have less than 24 hours where we're somewhat dehydrated, and then we can put it right back in. So you give your body less time to get into that stress response if you make that window smaller. And I say 24 hours, but that could be less for even some people. Maybe that's like a 12-hour water cut, if you will.
Is the less the water, the better? I mean, the less time, the better? Or
the less time, less time you're dehydrated, the less time you give your body to kind of go into that like emergency stress response state.
Okay.
But approaches to eating are less, but I want to say more as the week goes on, they're more concentrated on your certain foods. So again, that's going to be your carbohydrate sources and protein to preserve your lean mass as well. Um, you might not be eating as like diverse, but you're eating less, but you're eating the important things. And then you're setting yourself up to have that, to be 5 pounds over. Think about only having to lose 5 pounds from Monday to Friday. Not that hard, right? Especially if you can lose 3 pounds in a practice. That's 2 workouts. And then you're 24 hours out. Let's say it's Friday midday. You're wrestling on Saturday. Well, you stop super hydrating. You pull out water a little bit. If you have to completely, if not, you can still maintain some water. But you have your 3 pound practice. You go home, you eat a little bit for dinner, and in the morning you wake up and do another little workout for 2 pounds, maybe 3 pounds, and you're on weight. So the window of you being dehydrated was Friday afternoon to Sunday morning, and you ate dinner. So you fed yourself, and your hydration window is small. So you're really optimizing your ability to eat throughout the week as well as to stay hydrated throughout the week. And then since you fed yourself all week, after that after weigh-in binge that we all have done, we're famished, maybe it's not after weigh-ins, maybe it's usually the dinner nighttime. You're not as like famished as you would be because you were fed the whole week. Your body didn't starve as much as you typically would in the past.
So what are you eating after weigh-ins? Is there certain foods that you want to do if you have, say it's a tournament or something, what are you going to eat right after you weigh in? And then maybe what are you going to eat throughout the day if you have a tournament?
Sure. Yeah. The two most important things for after weigh-ins, especially if it's a 2-hour weigh-in or even a 1-hour weigh-in, are hydration and simple carbohydrates. The hydration is to obviously replenish the water loss, right? Especially if we're doing that hydration window. And actually, before I even go further down this, I want to preface this with this weight loss trajectory really should be preserved for maybe high school, college for sure, maybe high school. Any weight loss, any wrestler looking at weight loss earlier than that is really doing a disservice to themselves. So, elementary, early high school wrestlers, this is not weight loss to this degree should not be an approach for them. But yeah, so I just wanted to preface that before we move on. But
sure.
After weigh-ins, simple carbohydrates and hydration. Hydration to replenish that water loss. That if it's 24 hour, if it's 12-hour water cut, or just like water, strategic less water, to replenish that as much as you can. And then the simple carbohydrates for the energy. And you want it to be simple because if you have a short window until you're going to compete, you want it to, simple carbohydrates, essentially, you can eat them. They can make it into the bloodstream very quickly because they're digested quickly, and then you can use it as energy. Complex carbohydrates, not so much. They take a little bit to essentially they'll be the same thing, but it's not going to be broken down quick enough for you to be able to use it in 2 hours. You want those simples, and those simples are going to be like your sweets. And that's why a lot of times they'll be like, why are you giving us fruit snacks? Why are you giving us Rice Krispie treats? Why are you giving us craisins and things like that? It's because those sugary things will give you the energy. In addition to that, if you can afford to, and if your stomach can tolerate enough, some complex carbohydrates can be very useful as well. And that's especially if you have a tournament scenario, or maybe you're a heavyweight and you're the last match. You want that carbohydrate to make it into the body later on. So a lot of things that I do for that is like pastas, oatmeals, rice, things like that. They'll essentially give you energy a little bit later on. So especially if it's a tournament, if you're eating some complex carbohydrates after weigh-ins, you're going to have some energy for that second match already. So you're like pre-programming the energy to get into there. So those are two things that are simple, the hydration, but if you can afford to and your stomach can tolerate it, some complex ones as well that are a little bit more tolerable.
Okay. So you before this, you were talking about how you don't really recommend cutting weight for middle school and even like early in high school. what negative effects do you feel like there are for cutting weight at an early age, or even cutting, I mean, you talked about cutting weight wrong, which, you won't compete well. And do you feel like there's other kind of negative consequences for some of these kids that might be cutting weight very young?
Yeah, and I think from a couple different realms, really. I mean, it's relatively unnecessary, and it's harmful to your biggest growing years. This isn't the primary reason, but here's just a good example of bone mass is a good surrogate here. But about 10 to 20 years old is the time where you develop your peak bone mass. Um, 20 to 30 is when you relatively maintain it, and then after 30 years old you're only losing bone mass for the rest of your life. You can't make your bones stronger. So if you are cutting weight in that time of your bones growing and you're being able to put down that peak bone mass, well, you're only setting yourself up for fragility later in life. And I mean, that's kind of like more of an anecdote, but there's all sorts of things like that where you can do a lot of detriment to in those growing years. I don't know how much science there is behind growth stunting and support for that, but probably there is some growth stunting going on, right? If you're not providing your body with the nutrients it needs to grow and to get to through puberty, um, you're doing harm there. But then in addition to that, from like a social standpoint, most high school, middle school kids don't have access to someone who knows an appropriate way to approach that. So likely they're only going to form bad habits, so they're going to take them into college. And I'll say that a lot of those I had as well. I didn't have any access to someone who kind of knew the appropriate approach to it. So when I was in college, I had bad weight cutting habits.
Yeah. And one of the other things I see, like, is you have um, youth kids or younger kids, they're cutting weight so much they can't train hard. Just like you were saying with college guys, if you're cutting too much weight, you'll end up getting worse technical wise throughout the season. So if you can keep, feeling good and not having to cut as much weight, you're gonna be able to train a lot harder when it doesn't really, when your outcome doesn't really matter as much. You're winning a lot of matches in youth and middle school and early in high school aren't as important as, maybe later on. So you could hold back on cutting weight, and work on getting better and even go up a weight class or, whatever. So that's definitely one of the things that, if because a lot of times I think parents want their kids to win now and they don't want just like an athlete might not want that delayed gratification. They might not want to wait to achieve something great, but I think it's very important. I hear a lot of people who, you're not going to be burnt out. These kids are going to be able to go all the way into college and they weren't cutting a lot of weight and they're going to feel good about it. I know a couple examples of kids who cut too much weight in high school and they just quit because they're like, I'm done. And they were very good, but they're just like, one day they're sitting there dying and they're like, I'm done with this sport.
And
But
you also set up like poor relationship with food. If you're deprived of it, you're likely formulating bad dietary habits. But your relationship with food's a very mental thing as well, right? That's why we eat certain things that we like to eat. We have taste preferences, so it's a very social and cognitive thing that in our brains, that when we perceive the way we perceive food. So you're almost like rewiring, in some degrees it becomes very serious, but you're almost rewiring the brain to have a different relationship with food as opposed to enjoyment. So there's bad habits there, but yeah, it's the times in high school, middle school and high school are some of the times where you're learning all that technique. And if your practices are focused on weight cutting, you're not allowing any time for that growth. So you may not see it in the month's time span or a year's time span, but when that time that kid gets to college, he's either burnt out, or all those years where he could have been getting better, he's lagging behind because he spent so much time focusing on the weight throughout the week as opposed to getting better at wrestling. Which, let's be honest, when you haven't eaten all day, you ever have one of those days where you're super hungry, how much can you concentrate on anything?
yeah.
And we're asking these kids to exercise and be able to memorize complex movements.
Yeah, and even affecting school and all that other stuff. I wonder why your kid's
Yeah.
not doing well in school. It could be connected to that. So we talked mainly about cutting weight, and the last thing I want to talk about is, say someone wants to gain muscle, someone wants to move up a weight class. What, you don't really have to talk too much about maybe the strength training, but what kind of recommendations do you have? I guess cardio and nutrition wise, um, for somebody who wants to gain muscle mass.
So this is kind of the flip side to the body fat loss. So muscle mass is also a slower, any body composition change is a slower process. So it's kind of the flip side of the coin. You want to gain muscle mass, you have to give it a little bit of time, right? Too much of weight gain is probably going to be more of body fat mass. Your body can put you can put on body fat pretty easily. Um, Muscle is a little bit slower depending on the stimulus that you give it. So I see it's a slower process. Again, just to make it kind of simple, about 2% of your body weight a week you can put on muscle mass, if you're perfect. So it is a slower process. So understanding that it takes a little bit of time to be able to do that. Nutrition, how it plays a role in that is consistently. I think if your body's a house, and your muscle mass is the house that you want to build, um, the stimulus, the contractor who's going to build that house is the weight room, or the practices, or the workouts. You're tearing that muscle down, but the nutrition is the cement that you need to be able to rebuild. So you have to be giving your body consistent energy as well as consistent calorie intake to be able to supply the cement for that house. So if you don't have good eating habits in terms of like throughout the day, if you're eating 2 big meals a day, right? You're not eating breakfast in the morning. You're going to lunch at the cafeteria. If you're in high school or middle school, you're eating that big meal. You're not eating before practice. You go home, you eat one big meal. Well, you've only had 2 meals in that day. You haven't consistently fed yourself to be able to keep supplying the cement to build that house. You've only given yourself 2 occasions. So making sure that you're strategically doing that. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around protein. Protein is that cement, and consistently eating that within meals can be helpful. So making sure that that's at least a part of each meal, but not overdoing it as well. Just eating more protein isn't going to give you more muscle mass. Eating adequate protein time throughout the day is more important, and consistency. But there has to be muscle breakdown for muscle to rebuild. So that has to come from exercise. And the best exercise to do that is weight bearing exercise. That's why the weight room is helpful, but that doesn't mean you need a weight room. Wrestling does help that as well.
Okay. So, do you recommend, so one thing you're saying is you recommend eating, instead of 2 big meals, eating more meals throughout the day, maybe like at least three, maybe 4 or 5, something like that. And do you recommend, this is something I've heard, I don't know what your thoughts are. Do you recommend reducing cardio when you're trying to gain weight? Like almost like, cause you're trying to have more calorie intake compared to calorie outtake, like, you know what I mean? Trying to have more calories in versus out, or is that not really too big of an issue?
Well, it's kind of an interesting way to, I'd say the true answer to that is no. That that cardio is going to facilitate more body fat loss, which is going to be ideal, right? That more than it is going to do harm to your weight gain. I mean, if that's the only thing you're doing, yeah, you might not get the gains that you want, right? If you're running consistently every single day, there might be some because you're pushing your calorie expenditure up. But really, what you have to do is meet your calorie intake with that, to avoid that. So the short answer to that is no. Cardio is not going to hurt you. Really, you just have to make sure that you are also getting those weight-bearing activities as well. Wrestling in the room, doing like circuits in the wrestling room is very helpful for that. Those are pretty popular, and that's going to be where you're having that more of muscle tear. Wrestling itself, if you are old enough, and again, I'm speaking a little bit outside of my realm. I'm not a strength and conditioning specialist, but But if you're old enough to be in the weight room and weights training is part of your regimented program and it's appropriate, that can be very helpful as well.
All right. Well, that's all I got. You got anything else any other things you want to talk about?
No, the last thing I want to say is, in terms of wrestling and it kind of gets a bad rap in terms of food or dietary approaches. And the reality is just make sure you're feeding yourself consistently around your activity. You want to be eating before and after exercise to optimize those gains. But probably the most important thing, from a dietary perspective as well as a wrestling perspective, is to enjoy the sport and don't create bad habits because you want to be better at it. And the reality is those are only going to hurt you in the long run. So make sure that you're not sacrificing your nutrition for something that you want, because the reality is that's counterintuitive. And it doesn't allow you to enjoy the sport. Sport is supposed to be fun. You're supposed to enjoy it to some degree. There's a competition component to it, so we take it serious. We all did, but if you're having to sacrifice things that are important, you're going to do more harm than you can do good.
For sure. Well, I appreciate you having me on, or having you on, and hope to talk to you soon. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great to be here, Ed, but I appreciate you having me.
All right.